All right, so it is my honor to introduce all of you to Christian Davenport. Christian is a staff writer at the Washington Post, covering NASA and the space industry, and the author of the book The Space Barons. He has been on reporting teams that were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times and is a recipient of an Emmy Award for his work on the Discovery and Science channels covering SpaceX's first human spaceflight mission. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, Rocket Dreams: Musk, Bezos, and the Inside Story of the New Trillion-Dollar Space Race. In this gripping work of journalism, he chronicles a new age of space exploration where traditional players like NASA are joined by newcomers from the private sector like SpaceX and Blue Origin. The Washington Post writes in their review that Rocket Dreams is a thorough accounting of the growing friction between space billionaires, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, with insights from private jets and secret meetings, Twitter spats, and battles for government contracts. Davenport gently and powerfully illustrates the absurdity of certain events simply by straightforwardly describing them. He will be in conversation with Ian Shapira. Ian has been a staff writer at the Washington Post since 2000. He was on the Post team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for the paper's coverage of the Virginia Tech mass shooting. His recent stories on racism, sexism, sexual assault, and hazing at the Virginia Military Institute won a George Polk Award from Long Island University and the Paul Tobenkin Award for reporting on discrimination from Columbia University. Everyone, let us all welcome Christian Davenport and Ian Shapira.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's great to be here with my old friend, but very young friend, Chris Davenport. I actually have a quick question before we get going. I take it Elon and Jeff did not pose for this picture together. Like the publisher didn't get that to happen, did that?
No, we actually did.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. No, we did not.
I've known Chris since we both joined the Post full-time as Metro reporters in 2000. I think you came from a paper in Texas, Austin. I just come from college, and there would have been no way for either of us to know that you would go on to become one of the world's foremost journalists on space. At the time, I would have no idea you would become sort of steeped in the minutia of boosters, space station ports, and heat shields, mainly because, and I think this is important for the crowd to know, that we were first based together in Howard County as Metro reporters, where, according to a recent Washington Post archive search, your stories that were big hits back then were on an ice cream truck in Colombia and local farmers with unusually fertile corn crops. The headline was, "They can't believe their ears." So you've come a long way. Before we can get into the nitty-gritties of your book, I just wanted to step back real quickly, given what I've just said, to just ask you, you had been a Metro reporter all these years. You've covered the military, and I guess I just wanted, I've asked you about this a little bit here and there, but I've always wanted to know, just if you could just talk about it, how did those years prepare you to cover this complex technical story and to become a person who could write about it in such a fluid way for ordinary people to understand? I mean, there's lots of space reporters out there who cover this for industry trade publications, but you're writing this for the Washington Post. You have to write for ordinary people. You have to understand it, but translate it. How do you do that? How did you do that?
That's a great question. And first, I just want to say thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks to Politics and Prose. This is the hometown bookstore, literally in our neighborhood, and has hosted me for all of my books. And I think there was a little home team advantage for the last book, The Space Barons, because Brad Graham, one of the owners, had it up as the staff pick for like 6 months. It was awesome. And, the kids even from the local elementary school came and did a school tour, and my kids saw that. And I want to say thank you to Ian for doing this. I sent Ian a note like a week ago, just trying to fish. So you got everything, you all set? Do we need to do any prep? kind of wanting to see if he was going to, let me know what he was going to ask. And in true independent journalism fashion, he was like, all good. Go away. So bring it. Let's go. So yeah, I'd done a lot of different things at the Post, including writing about the corn crops and the ice cream truck. I embedded with U.S. forces in Iraq. I also embedded with a ice cream truck in Columbia, Maryland, and spent the day. It was a lot of fun, actually. I recommend that.
It's a classic genre. Metro.
Yeah. And had been doing a lot of different things, had a misguided foray into editing, and realized that was not for me and that I wanted to write. And I got to doing military, sort of the military-industrial complex, like writing about Lockheed Martin and Boeing and those kinds of companies, building weapons and fighter jets and those sorts of things based on my experience doing military things. And I got assigned in 2014 to a press conference at the National Press Club. Some guy, I'm not even sure I knew who he was, named Elon Musk, had filed a lawsuit against the Pentagon for the ability to launch, to compete to launch national security satellites. And I was like, who is this crazy guy who is suing the government agency he wants as their customer? He wants to win their contracts. He's filing a lawsuit, and nobody's ever really heard of SpaceX. And he starts out the press conference in sort of like typical Elon fashion. He doesn't talk about the lawsuit. What he's talking about, he starts talking about bringing back the rockets, his Falcon 9 rocket, and trying to land them so that they can be reused. And before they landed them on land, which they now do with some frequency, they would launch them and then pick a spot in the ocean and try to pinpoint the landing. And if they could hit the spot, that's how they knew they were getting better. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And it sounded absolutely nuts to me. Like, what? But then I went back and I started researching it and started paying attention. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And then within a year or so of that, he actually landed one of the boosters. And it was this sort of seminal moment. And the other thing I would say just about this is the other thought I had at the time, because I was still supposed to be doing Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, and there wasn't this great appetite at the Post to do space. And so I kind of did it. I went a little bit rogue and did it on my own. But if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk at the time, Richard Branson, Paul Allen of Microsoft, all of them investing enormous amounts of their own money into space, I thought, as journalists, that's what we do. We follow the money, right? So I said, someone really ought to be paying attention to this. So I kind of crept into it.
Going rogue at the Washington Post. I've never heard of that before. Before we go down the downslope here, I just thought you should read a few paragraphs from this one section, and you can set it up for people.
Okay.
The stars.
Right. Okay. So this is the launch, a SpaceX launch of a rocket. It was in 2018 called Falcon Heavy, and Falcon Heavy rocket is like, think of it as a pencil, right? It's a Falcon Heavy's essentially three pencils like attached together, and it's a total of 27 engines, which is in rocketry that's an insane number. That's a lot of engines. And Elon had been leading up to this saying, like, yeah, this may not work. this thing may very well blow up. And he gave it 50-50 odds for this rocket to launch, which he's since sort of, they still launch it, but somewhat sidelined. Okay. With 20 seconds left in the countdown, when the launch director called out, SpaceX, Falcon Heavy, go for launch, they went nuts, pulsing with the energy that came with the belief that they were witnessing history. As the countdown came to the T-minus 10-second mark, they shouted in unison, 10, 9, 8, all the way until the engines, all 27 of them, ignited, pushing a huge plume of exhaust into the air. The rocket cleared the tower, and those who were worried about the launch pad breathed a sigh of relief, because he had said, we're just going to blow up the whole launch pad. I was standing on the lawn outside the press center of the Kennedy Space Center, watching from a distance of about 3 miles, the closest one could get to the pad. Like other launches I had attended, I could see the white-orange flash of the engines igniting, but I knew it would take a few moments before the sound arrived. It hit me square in the chest, a wall of sound coming in unrelenting waves. As the rocket rose, I thought of Musk's prediction that it might explode. I also knew that it should be flying not just up, but eventually out and away from the coast, over the Atlantic Ocean, which had been cleared of all boat traffic. But at first, it seemed like it was going straight up, meaning that if it did blow up, the shrapnel would be raining down over land, maybe right on top of us. But it didn't explode. It kept going and going. Inside SpaceX headquarters, it was pure pandemonium. They had cheered during the countdown, when the engine fired, as it continued to climb, and now as the side boosters separated and began their journey back to Earth, where they would attempt to land simultaneously on a pair of pads at Cape Canaveral, a few hundred yards from the shoreline. As they got close, they reignited 3 of their first-stage engines, slowing them down. Their landing legs unfurled, and they touched down softly at almost exactly the same moment, triggering sonic booms that reverberated across the coast and set off car alarms in the parking lot of the press site.
Great, vivid writing. So much of the book's tension, its plot, stems from the very cover of the book, a rivalry between 2 men with enormous egos and pocketbooks. The most pivotal point, in my view, after having read this book, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but for me, that's what it was. It came in like a 12-month period between the spring of 2020 and 2021. First, in April 2020, all 3 companies they win this NASA development contract. They're going for the big NASA development contract, with Blue Origin receiving the lion's share of this huge contract, of this developmental contract to build a lunar lander, a rocket that would take you to the moon, basically. But then, so Bezos thinks he's on top. He's won. He's going to win. But a year later, he doesn't, and Musk wins. And his proposal comes in at $3 billion, and Bezos's proposal comes in at $6 billion. And this was. For me, this is like high drama in Washington, and Bezos is fuming and is so angry. And it gets to the point where I felt like he had crossed a line. He had gone into sour grapes mode. He lost the bid, filed a grievance with the GAO, then filed a lawsuit. And I kept wondering, you're going to lose. Like, why are you doing this? And I just wanted to ask you, and then also one more thing I wrote this down too, is that the company's CEO, Bob Smith, he gives this quote to the New York Times, and it's very, it's really atypical for NASA to make this kind of mistake. Something along those.
Condescending.
It's very condescending, and anyway, it just felt unseemly for someone of Bezos' stature, and then one more thing I'll ask you about this, and this really got me. After he had exhausted all of his options, Bezos then goes back to Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, I think at the time, and he says, I'll throw in $2 billion. And I just wanted you to sort of unpack some of that sequence, tell us what you thought was interesting about that, and how you, who have been observing Bezos for so long, how did you personally perceive his handling of this loss? I mean, anyway, yeah.
No, that's a great question, and I thank you for highlighting that. And you're 100% right. Like this is the crescendo of the narrative, of the tension building. So yeah, you nailed it. This is, and so, and why is because for years leading up to this, Elon and SpaceX are charging so far ahead and make the decision, we are going to be a partner with NASA. So they win contracts to fly cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. They win a contract to fly astronauts to the International Space Station. They win contracts to fly national security satellites for the Pentagon. So they're bringing in all this revenue. And Blue Origin, for the most part, particularly with the NASA side, had sat those out and decided not really to compete the way that SpaceX was. And then when it came to the moon, they saw at the very beginning of the Trump administration that the Trump administration, unlike Obama, which had this sort of vague journey to Mars, we're going to go to an asteroid, the Trump administration came in Trump 1.0 and said, we're going to the moon. This is what we're doing. And they tried to position themselves from day one, even before, like during the transition, they tried to position themselves to be NASA's partner on this moon program. And even gave an unsolicited pitch to NASA saying, you're going back to the moon, we can help you. And Jeff met personally with then the acting NASA administrator because the Trump administration, it was so early, they hadn't even nominated anybody to do it. So now there is a program, they're going to the moon. Jeff and Blue Origin assemble what they call the national team. This is Blue Origin partnering with Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Draper, like heavy hitters, long aerospace heritage, long connections, not just to NASA, but in Congress, and huge lobbying power in Washington. And the way these contracts work is they're sort of like a first round, and NASA will give out. In the first round, they divvied up $1 billion, and they give them to 3 companies. And Blue Origin, the national team, won the lion's share of that. It was like $570 million. SpaceX was a distant third. That NASA's like, you know what, we'll just kind of keep you in on this. And they won $135 million. And then comes the next round. And maybe I'll tell it this way. We were on vacation. It was spring break. It was April 2021. And I got a tip. And, these contract, they never leak because, they announce them after 5 p.m., after the markets close. They can have huge effects on publicly traded companies. And somebody called me and said, Blue Origin lost. SpaceX won. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, everyone was just like, because everyone thought they were going to win. And I somehow got a second source. And my editor was like, oh, yeah, all right, we're good. And I was just like, I couldn't believe it. I was so nervous. I was like, no, we can't get it yet. And somehow I actually got the document that said it. And then we went with the story. And I was so scared because we published it. And I was like, even though it was well-sourced, I was like, man, if this is wrong, and we just said that Jeff Bezos lost this contract, in the paper that he owns,
you would get a 2 on the evaluation, for not exceeding the.
That's right.
That
would have been rough.
good for you. Yeah.
But they lost, and they lost. And what's interesting is, so they lost for a lot of reasons. One, Elon bid $3 billion. They bid $6 billion. Right. So they were twice as expensive, but. I think the bigger picture, and this is when you write these books, and you can go a little bit deeper, and explain it. SpaceX won with this even crazier rocket. I was talking about Falcon Heavy before. They bid a rocket called Starship, which makes like Falcon Heavy look like a pipsqueak. I mean, it's got 33 engines. It needs to be refueled in space, which has never happened before. It's just gargantuan, and to think that something like that could land on the moon, it's almost like ridiculous. And I think Blue Origin, I know Blue Origin, poo-pooed it and didn't see it as that much of as a threat, at least in some quarters. Whereas what they bid was what NASA said they wanted, a very traditional lunar lander that looked like it could have been in the Smithsonian. I mean, it looked like it came out of Apollo. Yeah. And because that's what NASA knew. That's what they said they wanted, so that's what they bid. And it turns out that's not what they wanted. What they wanted was somebody to push the envelope to try to innovate and find new technology, which is what Starship represents. So now, as it turns out, to fast forward a little bit, none of those gimmicks, the lawsuit, the $2 billion that Jeff promised, none of that worked. They did, however, through Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington State, were able to convince NASA to have a second competition. They won that, and what they bid was something totally novel, and it did not look like their previous bid at all. I mean, talking about reusable spacecraft, refueling in orbit, all these innovative technologies.
Wow. Classic, the end run to another person in Congress. One of the comments in the story in the book that kind of hit me in the stomach a little bit as a Washington Post employee was when one anonymous executive tells you he wants Blue Origin to be what he's remembered for, and he wants to be at his legacy. So that I think that spoke to his sort of desire to win that so aggressively. Even though he wanted to be his legacy, you had these passages in your book which I guess on the one hand they weren't surprising, but on the other hand they were surprising, which was that Bezos does not spend all of his time on Blue Origin. He doesn't spend every day there like Musk had been working there every 5 days a week or more than that. And I just wanted to ask you, what were the you know these two men better than most, and what are the major distinctions in their management style or their leadership style? Have you seen? What are the differences, and can you draw dotted lines between their styles and the results that they have achieved in space?
Yeah. Famously, Jeff used to talk about that he would spend 1 day a week at Blue Origin Wednesdays. That's changed in the last year and a half, 2 years. He's there much more often. But during the pandemic, for example, when Amazon became a lifeline, he did kind of disappear. He did have, I think it's fair to say, something like a midlife crisis, right? And that resonated across the company. In a lot of ways, it has resembled more of a legacy contractor aerospace, like a Boeing, as opposed to a startup. Again, I think that's beginning to change. You're seeing that with the architecture for the new lunar lander, what they've been able to do with their new rocket, New Glenn, and some of the other technologies that they're pursuing. But SpaceX, I mean, it's all about building new things from the very beginning, and it's all about innovation. Gwen Shotwell, the president, has created a culture where she says she wants her employees to be mouthy. She wants young engineers to sort of stand up. And one of the stories that I tell in the book, which was the excerpt in the Washington Post, I think is illustrative of the SpaceX culture. And that is when they were competing for the NASA contract to fly astronauts to the International Space Station. Again, competing. They had not won it. NASA came to them and said, you're going to dock your spacecraft to our $100 billion space station. And there are astronauts on board, so you cannot crash into the station. So we built this docking mechanism for you, and all you got to do, it's free, take it, bolt it onto the end of your spacecraft, because that's what we want you to use. This young, 36-year-old, relatively new SpaceX engineer took one look at it and said, this thing is not very good. It's heavy, it's got all of the software that's required to extend out, to reach into the port. It's got these arms. Each one has a power source. That's 6 different points of failure. So he's like, I think I can improve on this quite a bit. And he used, for the prototype, the shocks from a mountain bike. Instead of using a motor, he used springs. Got parts essentially from like an industrial Home Depot. And then presents it to Elon, actually presented to his boss, and his boss was like, oh, let's go show Elon. And he was like, he kind of got freaked out a little bit. And he's like, oh, when? And his boss is like, yeah, now. We're going to go over and just roll it over to his cubicle and show it to him. And he's like, okay. And Elon took one look at it. He's like, yeah, this is better. Do this. So now, again, they had not won the contract. They're competing against Boeing for the contract. And this is back in 2014. And they have to convince NASA. NASA's like, wait, you're not using the system that we made for you? Like what? Like who do you think you are? And anyway, he had to convince them. They did end up convincing them, and they won the contract. But it's that kind of a thing.
They were like, we're giving you this free gift. Why don't you just take? And then
exactly.
And then some punk, 35-year-old punk. Yeah. I wanted to move forward a little bit in time. October 2024, and then January 2025. There are back-to-back milestones for these two companies. In October 2024, SpaceX launched it's called the Starship Super Heavy booster, I believe it's called. which is I'm trying to get that into one of my articles, but to get some more clicks. But when the rocket, I watched this video, and it felt like I was watching a movie, a Hollywood movie. If you haven't seen it, basically the rocket is landing, and it basically these, you'll describe it better, but these like chopstick arms come out and grab it and hoist it up against the metal tower. And then the next month is it's the New Glenn, I believe, for Bezos. And I just wanted you to just walk the audience through just briefly why those two moments back to back were so important for the companies.
It's a little bit of a blur because there was so much news on the space beat. I kind of forgot it was like back to back like that because
it's crazy, yeah.
So Starship, again, this is the rocket and the spacecraft collectively known as Starship that NASA now is investing several $1 billion into to land astronauts on the moon, as part of this space race with China. And actually, it's really far behind, sort of imperiling U.S. chances. That said, what Starship represents, again, is Elon and SpaceX trying to disrupt themselves. So they built the workhorse rocket, the Falcon 9, which lands now. It's landed more than 100 times. I don't even know how many. It's just routine. They always land it. Maybe you've seen video of it. It landed on a ship at sea or back at Cape Canaveral, Vandenberg, and as it comes down, it deploys these landing legs and that come out at the last second, and land. Thing is with spacecraft and rockets, mass, weight, all of it is crucial. And so those landing legs that's hardware that you have to put on the rocket. And also it's landing at a ship at sea or even on a landing pad a few miles away from the launch pad. And what he's trying to do with Starship is to launch not just every couple of days, which is what they do with Falcon 9, but multiple times a day. And you can't do that if you're landing out at sea. So if you land back at the launch pad,
you can go back in a couple hours.
You fuel it up and you go.
Yeah.
And that's the significance of that. And you save the weight. But it's, when you see that come back and then here are these, the chopstick like arms catch a rocket, that's like several stories tall. It's remarkable engineering now as to whether they're going to sort of get those airline-like operations. We'll see, but that's a crucial first step. Cool. I mean, Elon had some quote like, when you're launching rockets, you don't want to look at the calendar; you want to look at your watch.
So I feel like we're at that point of the show where we have to address some elephants in the room.
Please. Here we go.
The first elephant would be that here you are, and here I am, a Washington Post reporter, right? And you've been writing candidly about Jeff Bezos, who has owned our newspaper since 2013. A very basic question: how has that tested you as a journalist? And the reason I ask that specifically is that you talk about this in your book. You say at one point in the book you obtained a white paper from Blue Origin, a secret white paper, and outlining Bezos's big dreams for delivering supplies and energy and even homes to the lunar surface. But Bezos offered you an interview. Eventually, that turned into written statements, perhaps. So I just wanted you to ask on a very broad level, how has this tested you? And then in that specific case, do you feel like sometimes he has to give you a cold shoulder to protect you, to protect your independence? Or is that just him being a billionaire who does whatever he wants to do?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he doesn't give us any special treatment. And of course, at the Post, we cover him without fear or favor, the way we would cover anybody else. And that is, it was true then, it's true now, and it's something I'm, care a lot about and I'm proud about. I got no special treatment. I have interviewed him now several times for this book and the last book. And I will tell you, for the last book, I've been trying to get an interview with him. I'm just going to tell the story quickly.
Yeah.
And if you know anything about Jeff, you know that his grandfather is incredibly important to him. He spent every summer on his grandfather's ranch. I actually think his grandfather is where he got his passion for space. His grandfather worked in the Pentagon for ARPA, which is the predecessor for DARPA. And in my research for the last book, I came across a press release from 1961 about his grandfather leaving ARPA to go back to the Atomic Energy Commission. And there's a picture of Jeff's grandfather on the press release. And he was in D.C. for a conference, and I went up to his PR guy who saw me coming and was like, don't even come near me, get away from me. And I was like, hold on, I'm going to show you this. And I showed him the press release, and he says, stay right here. Hold on. And he got Jeff, and he said, Jeff, Chris has something for you. And I showed it to him, and I said, it was not maybe my most smooth pitch of all time, but I said, look, man, and I think I even called him man. I'm like, what are you doing? And that voice in the back.
You called Bezos
I think
man?
I did. I said, look, man, I'm just trying to impress you with the level of research I'm doing. I've been trying to get this interview. I'm doing this book. I don't see you through the lens of Amazon. I see you through the lens of space. I know space is incredibly important to you. Would you talk to me for the book? There it is. Like I could hear the heartbeat, right? And he goes, okay. I'm inclined to participate. I was like, inclined. 2 months later, 3 months later, he did sit down for now.
That's great. That feels sort of very classic of a super famous guy to be very delicate in his wording around that. Musk has, when your accounts of your interactions with Musk felt a little more, I don't know, freewheeling maybe. You had described at one point interviewing him in a hangar at 11 o'clock at night, and for a long time, and this was hours before a huge launch. And it just felt like maybe Musk, I don't know, was he just more cavalier about these, does he still offer that same kind of access now, given his role in politics, or has he sort of, pulled back a little bit?
No, I mean, clearly he's changed. We don't have the access to him. He's, openly hostile to the media. I think he treats the Space Press Corps a little bit differently because he's known some of us for years and, kind of knows that we really sort of have at least a basic understanding of the engineering and the importance of it, of what they're doing. That interview in the hangar, I mean, the reason it was like 11 o'clock, it was supposed to be at like 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah, it kept being delayed.
It kept being delayed because Elon's always late for everything. They're like, oh, it's going to be at 5. Oh, it's going to be at 6. And the launch was like at 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and ended up being 11. And literally, it's in the hangar, and the hangar's at the base of the launch pad. And the security team was like, you guys, at midnight, hard stop. You have to get out because we have to fuel the rocket. The astronauts are coming. And, those were where you could send him a note and he would respond and give, not just respond, but give, somewhat thoughtful answers. I mean, the one thing about Elon, he's not going to tell you how he feels about something, but if you have a question about engineering and how the rocket works and achieving, reusability, or how you're going to create a fuel depot in Earth orbit, he's more than happy to talk about that. Obviously now we don't see that as much. And I think we should, just talk about, the fact that now there are a lot of people in the space industry who are worried that if Elon is the, sort of the face of the space enterprise, which in some ways he still is, that jeopardizes it. And the fact that SpaceX is so dominant that you have so much of the nation's spacefaring capabilities in this one hand, in the hand of this one company that's led by this one guy, which is troubling.
Unpredictable. I mean, we all remember when he went on the Joe Rogan show and smoked a joint, which caused a lot of consternation on Wall Street, at least. That gets me to the next question, which was, again, when you step back from the book, you see these two men are so disciplined in their space life, right? And they are, in many ways, nerds about the minutia of getting cargo and humans to space, deep space, one day safely. And yet, despite that rigor, they can either come off as cavalier in their communications publicly, or they have no problem being, explicitly political. In the case of Bezos, more recently, and everything from, and you note this in your book, Amazon's purchase of the $40 million for to purchase the rights for Melania Trump's documentary, to the $1 million inauguration, and so how do you, as an observer of these two men, square that kind of the contradiction? I guess that's how I view it, is like they can be so disciplined in this one space, literally space, but then it feels like they will have less rules governing their other parts of their lives. And I don't know if that's actually deliberate in some respects, right? I mean, if Bezos was here, he'd say, I donated to Biden administration, and we have to, and I curried favor with Trump even in the first administration before, I became unpopular about that. So I'm wondering how you square all that.
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you brought that up about the first administration, because there are scenes in the book that I think, show how when he was, trying to curry favor with the Trump administration during the inauguration just recently, that was foreshadowed by his actions in the first Trump administration.
He was having a party for Ivanka and Kellyanne Conway.
He was doing that. There's a scene in the book where Bob Smith, the CEO of Blue Origin, wanting better access to the White House, to the Trump White House 1.0, worried that Elon and SpaceX was already sort of embedded, in that sort of firmament, that Bob Smith sits down with Mike Pence's chief of staff. Mike Pence was head of the National Space Council. And Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, cuts Bob Smith off right at the very beginning and says, "You have a Washington Post problem." And that was because the Post had written an editorial critiquing one of Mike Pence's speeches about space, a very big space, basically poo-pooing it, saying the moon, we don't need to go there, and it was a very critical op-ed. And Mark Short wanted Bob Smith to get the Washington Post to retract it, which of course was ridiculous. So actually they wrote an op-ed, tried to get it published in the Post. It didn't happen. And they took out a full-page ad in the Post to try to do that.
They paid for it like anybody else would.
Right. And so you saw them trying to curry favor with the Post sort of earlier on.
Got it. Yeah, it's a fascinating conflict that we at the Post are dealing with constantly, and as anyone in this room probably knows. So anyway.
Can I just say one more thing, just to the second part of your question about the diligence and the engineering? I just to be clear about one thing, a lot of people, spaceflight, particularly human spaceflight, gets romanticized. We're writing about it, this title, Rocket Dreams. I get it. You see it in movies. Human spaceflight, it's so dangerous. It is so dangerous. And I hope nobody else dies. I hope there are no more accidents. Chances are there are going to be, right? Like Columbia, Challenger. There are so many times where there's so many close calls. One little thing goes wrong, and it's harrowing. And I just don't think people understand that.
Well, I felt that's a great tee up for my next question, because there's this point in the book where it's May 2020 when SpaceX is sending up 2 NASA astronauts, right? And this is a big deal because it's the first time since 2011 that that American astronauts will be launched from U.S. soil. It had been dormant. And I mean, again, if you have been following this for a while, American astronauts were being sent into space on a Russian aircraft. So, again, not news to people in the business or even people who might pick up on the news or read the news, but it's still shocking to read that. But going back to this moment of being a flying to space being harrowing, there is a scene in this book where President Trump has flown down to be there for this big momentous day, and the weather's not great, and he keeps and they're like, "We're not going to go," and he's like, "You should go." And I'm like, "No," and I feel like I'm reading a novel at this point where I'm like wanting you're kind of like crying out for the character not to do what they're about to do. Trump backs down. They scrub the launch for that day, and then it gets rescheduled for like a few days later or whatever, and then again I was shocked again. 15 minutes before the launch, literally before the thing is about to take off, President Trump's like, "I want to see them. I want to talk to them." And I was like, they got things to do. And I just wanted to ask you about that. Like, were the astronauts, did they talk to you about that? Like, what that was like for them? And I don't know.
Yeah, well, the astronauts talked to me afterwards and said that I don't think they heard about it afterwards.
Okay.
I don't think they even bothered them with it at the time.
Okay.
And there is that scene where it was interesting because there was a White House aide who was going around the White House before the launch saying, like, he's got so much executive power. He can pardon people. He can bomb other countries. But what he cannot do is interfere with this launch. If they say we're not launching, that's it. Back in Air Force One, go back. Like, you can't do anything. And then when it was becoming clear that they were not going to be able to launch because there was too much static electricity in the atmosphere, the NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, is like, turns to Vice President Pence, who's sitting with him, and says, should we go tell him? Like, it's not going to happen? And Pence is like, yeah, you got to go tell him. And then he sees like how nervous Jim Bridenstine is. He goes, I'll go with you.
I have two very quick questions, and then we'll bring it on to the audience here. One very broad question, got to ask it. Looking into the future, will any of us in this room live long enough to see tourists fly to the moon for a reasonable rate?
What's reasonable?
What about Mars?
Reasonable rate to the moon? No. Possible on a suborbital space trip. I mean, going up, 4 minutes of weightlessness, come back down. Blue Origin, actually, they are flying their New Shepard vehicle. That's their really small rocket that just goes up about 65 miles or so and comes back down. They're doing that almost monthly now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's starting to happen. Reasonable rate, it all depends. Really, it all depends on Starship and if they can get that going. I mean, if it really is like airline operations and it lands and then you refuel it and you go, maybe.
All right. Finally, you are a space journalist, but Chris, do you ever want to be a journalist in space?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
And there's some precedent for this. When the space shuttle came around, and NASA thought the space shuttle was going to be a shuttle that was going to fly so frequently, they would just run out of astronauts to fill the ranks, so that they were going to take people from the American public to fly on space shuttle. And the first person in that program was Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, and they had the Teacher in Space program. Next was going to be a journalist, and they had already gotten hundreds of journalists to apply for it, and they actually knocked it down to like 40 finalists.
Oh, wow.
At the time that Challenger exploded. So anyway, I had gone to the NASA archives and I had pulled out the application for the Journalist in Space program. And when I interviewed Jeff for the last book, I slid it across the table to him.
Fantastic.
And said, but no invitation as of yet.
Gotcha. All right, we'll do questions. I always say this whenever I do these events, that it's really emphasis on question, not op-ed. So when you come to the microphone, just ask a question. That'd be great.
Or as I say, please pose your question in the form of a question.
Hi, Chris. First, as someone of a shared age, I'm impressed you can read a book in your lap without glasses. A generational question. You mentioned the Challenger disaster a couple times. That was a core memory for folks our age, I imagine, maybe even for Bezos and maybe a lesser extent Musk living abroad, I imagine, as he did. And I would think their leadership teams, too, at this point, given who I imagine they are. Does that seem to color their thinking at all? A loss of life that was such a moment for America?
Yeah, yes. So I remember interviewing Elon on the eve of the first human spaceflight mission. All the things that SpaceX had done, they had never flown humans before. They had never put humans in orbit. It is fair to say Elon was terrified. He was so nervous, and he just at one point I remember he just he goes into his head. Sometimes he disappears a little bit. And he just said, "I can't mess it up." And he's looking down. He's like, "I just can't mess it up." It was almost like you could see it on his face. The other person it really resonated with was the NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, who was in elementary school during Challenger. That was a core memory for him, and that's what he's thinking. Like, this could very well happen on my watch. Here we are trying to return human spaceflight to American shores for the first time since 2011 when the space shuttle was retired. And that's his first memory. He wasn't alive for Apollo 11 landing on the moon. That's his memory. So, yes, when we talk about how dangerous it is, that resonates with them for sure.
So mine's a little bit of a follow-up question to that. These two leaders have very different risk profiles on how they manage their companies and their style in a very ultra-conservative industry. So can you talk a little bit about can you talk a little bit about risk management, not only in their companies, but industry-wide? Because it seems to be transforming the paradigm that many operators and the whole complex is operating under.
Yeah, so everyone, I presume, have seen like all the fireballs that, like SpaceX blows stuff up all the time. They will say those are all successes because, they learn from it. And because they're flying so often, they know their vehicle so well, what the margins are on all the valves, all the pressure vessels, all of these things. But they're the engineers. They know, just how dangerous this stuff is. SpaceX lost 2 Falcon 9s. It lost the Dragon spacecraft, the capsule, right after it had done a test run to the International Space Station that's supposed to carry the astronauts. Then they're doing a test of the emergency abort system, and it blows up, right? There's another way to go through it, which is a more sort of traditional way where you are testing every single component over and over and over again, which is, kind of a NASA way of doing it. It's a government way. Arguably, that's the appropriate way for a government to do it, that every time it launches, it has to work. It just has to. What that means is it costs so much more. It takes so much longer. And you don't necessarily get the data going forward. And I think there's, great debate about which is the best path forward for that.
You have not mentioned anything about the third billionaire in the original commercial space race, Richard Branson. And I wonder if you have any comments on him, and also your forecast or prediction on the current space race between the U.S. and China for humans on the moon.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Yeah, Richard's sort of gone away. Virgin Galactic, he's not involved at Virgin Galactic, which is his company against a suborbital space company trying to take tourists to the edge of space for a few minutes of weightlessness. Richard flew. The company realized that their space plane, the way it was structured, just wasn't going to be profitable. So they're working now on a bigger one that would be more efficient, carry more passengers, be able to fly more frequently. I think a lot of people are skeptical as to whether that's going to work. But Richard's, he's a sort of a sweetheart, actually. You
hang out with him at his island.
I have never been to Necker, but if he's watching, I'd go. The space race with China it's a sub-theme in this book. And they are targeting the South Pole of the moon, which is where NASA wants to go. That's where the water is. They have shown extraordinary capability to be able to in their space program, not just for the moon. I will sort of talk about it in this way. There are 2 flags on the moon right now. They're both Chinese. The flags that were planted by the Apollo astronauts, well, the picture of Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag from Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin wrote in his memoir that as the ascent vehicle took off, the thrust knocked it over. But even without that, the radiation environment and the harsh environment of space has essentially bleached it white, reduced it to tatters. So when China landed on the far side of the moon a few years ago, they unfurled a flag made out of composite materials that they took a year or so to work on, designed to withstand the radiation environment. In June, when they landed on the far side of the moon, which again, only they have done, and they did a sample return mission, they unfurled another flag. This one was made out of basalt, essentially volcanic rock, which they found on Earth, but is plentiful on the moon. The significance of that and why they did that is because they are taking a material that you can find out on the moon and use it for resources. When American settlers went west, they could live off the land. There's deer to eat, trees for shelter, water. If you go to the moon, you need to live off the land. They took the volcanic rock, turned it to lava, extracted threads from the lava, and weaved a Chinese flag out of it that is on the moon today.
So a lot of the conversation has centered around rockets so far. I wanted to hear your thoughts on some of the mega constellations like Starlink and Kuiper that are important to these two men.
Yeah, Starlink is, it's almost a miracle that it was successful. I mean, there have been attempts to have internet constellations before. They went bankrupt. SpaceX was able to be successful in large part because they have a reusable rocket, and they're providing their own launch costs. What do they have, like more than 7,000 satellites up? It's extraordinary. It's also extraordinary that there have been some close calls. Space is vast, but it's also crowded, but there hasn't been a collision, which speaks to the autonomy of it. But you sort of do fear that, with the more spacecraft that are up there, more satellites whizzing around orbit. In orbit, you're flying at 5 miles per second, that if it crashes into something, it creates enormous amounts of debris, which is a real problem that will last up there for a long time. It's also an example of where SpaceX is leading sort of the Jeff Bezos enterprise, Amazon. Amazon also, they are investing something like $10 billion into the Kuiper internet satellite system. Again, these are satellites that will beam an internet signal to a ground station so you can have internet wherever you are, cruise ship, airplanes, and now direct to your cell phone. And when we talk about, $1 trillion space economy, we are not at $1 trillion space economy yet. It's a race sort of toward that. I think it's those kinds of systems that are going to enable that. That's where there's a real world, on the ground business value with revenue, a service that you're going to pay for.
All right, one more.
Do you think Artemis is going to work? And separately, why do you think after all these decades, no other country has walked on the moon?
Why no other countries have walked on the moon? I'll take the first one. Is Artemis going to work? It depends on what your definition is, right? Artemis is... This is the NASA moon program to go back to the moon. It's unlike Apollo in the sense that if it works, it's not just to send 12 astronauts there, walk around, hit a golf ball, plant a flag that's going to get obliterated, and then come home after a couple of days. The idea is to go and to stay and to build a quasi-permanent presence there, particularly around the South Pole where there are resources and water, and to set up that presence. I think it's possible. I think our timeline is in jeopardy. Starship, which is the vehicle that, again, NASA is using to return astronauts there, is behind schedule. It's going to require, all these new technologies, refueling in orbit, which is going to require SpaceX to launch, 10, 12. We don't actually know how many rockets they're going to have to launch in quick succession for that to happen. China's moving very quickly in that regard. I don't know that China ultimately will be building a base there, but what you're seeing is China partnering with Russia and all kinds of other countries, as are we. As part of the Artemis program, we have the Artemis Accords, more than 35 allied nations who are partnering with the United States. So to think about Artemis, it's not only about scientific discovery or national prestige. This is a diplomatic effort. It's not a military effort per se, but it is a national security effort, for sure.
Thanks for doing this. Congratulations.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to stick around and sign some books if people want to buy them.